Hello, my name is Peter Parslow. I'm the chair of ISO TC211. I've been doing this role since the beginning of 2022. But before that, I was involved in several ISO TC211 metadata standards over the last 10 years or so. In this short video, I'm going to introduce the story of ISO TC211 metadata standards. There's only a short high-level description of what each of them contains. So this goes back to the 1990s, well before I was involved. At that time, several communities were formalizing metadata. That's data about data, which isn't that helpful, but gives you the general idea. One well-known example is the Dublin Core metadata set, which was created in 1995 in Dublin, Ohio, when several US computer centers got together. When Dublin Core was published in 1998, it contained 15 elements. Much earlier, in 1906, the United States also had a Federal Geographic Data Commission who were tasked with developing, maintaining standards for mapping data across the United States. And by 1998, they already had hundreds of metadata elements organized into 10 packages. So when TC211 got started, it's that geographic set that we started working from. And by the time we published in 2003, ISO 19115 contained 14 packages with over 300 elements and sub-elements, but a core of 22 elements that are basically the Dublin Core ones, plus several specific to geographic information. For example, the location of the data and the reference system it's in, or the spatial resolution. I should say, at that point, Dublin Core was a flat vocabulary, just a list of terms. FGDC and ISO 19115 took a structured approach, so it's more explicit which elements are about the metadata, which are about the data, and which are about methods of distributing the data. ISO 19119 gives a meta model, an overall model for describing web services in the architecture that was common at the time, and adds some metadata elements for describing web services. And ISO 19115 Part 2 is elements specific for describing imagery data. 19115 at that point concentrated on what we might call vector data, object-based data about features in the world. Over time, we've learned lessons and we've therefore revised the standards. So 19115 Part 1, published in 2014, incorporated the service data, metadata from 19119. And so that new version of 19119 isn't really a metadata standard anymore, it just describes the web services architecture. And 19115 Part 2 as an extended itself to describe the acquisition of data, and in the process realized it's not just about the acquisition of imagery data, but can be used for describing the acquisition of any kind of data. Now, all these conceptual metadata standards aren't, of course, directly implementable. And so we took our own abstract encoding rules and the in-fashion encoding form of XML, in fashion in that decade, if not this one, and we've produced XML encodings of each of these standards. In that first version of 19139 in 2007, it covered the encoding of the original 19115 and had to include some specific XML encoding rules in order to do so. Outside of TC211, the same approach was applied to ISO 19119, and the resulting srv.xsd was never formally published by ISO, but it was widely used. And in the same way, the imagery metadata in Part 2 was turned into the XML encoding of that data in Part 2 of 19139. So we then have 3 XML schemas and standards that can be used together, but that gives quite a complex picture. So when we revised the schemas to produce ISO 19115 Part 3, we took the opportunity to bring together the schemas that were in 19139 and Part 2 of 19139 and also to pull in the SRV schema. So this gives an overall one-stop shop standard for the XML encoding of all of that metadata. Of course, it's still a large and complex schema. At the same time, that meant a revision of 19139 to take out the XML schemas themselves and just leave the detailed encoding rules for creating XML schemas from the UML logical models. And these rules have been used by other ISO standards that represent data about data, so feature catalogs, things like that. They're a parallel to perhaps better known rules in the GML standard for taking UML models of feature data and turning it into XML schemas to validate those models. So the parallel of the 19136 rules for data are actually about the world, and the 19139 rules for data about the data. And a complex schema set, 1915 part 3, for all the metadata that's in those logical models. It's modular, so you can just use parts of it, but it is a big standard. So there have been some amendments made to 19115 part 1, notably to take account of the difference between static and dynamic coordinate reference systems. So that is, how does the coordinate reference system cope with tectonic plate change? And this needed some amendments to the metadata. How much that depends on you, of course, depends on what you want to do with the data and whether you expect it to be used in situations where tectonic drift is an issue. For example, land registration, things where the data is needed to be, the same pair of numbers will mean the same place in the world decades later. So there's a current revision project for the XML schema for 19115 part 3, and that is taking into account those amendments, but it's also working harder to make it modular, so you can use parts of the 19115 part 3 schemas depending on what you want to. Meanwhile, the community outside of TC211 has been evolving its standards as well. The Dublin core standard has evolved over time, and W3C have published its DCAT based on it, and moved that to DCAT 2, and currently working on DCAT 3. The European Commission's done work to geo-enable DCAT and helpfully produced a mapping from the old 19115 to geo-DCAT. Less formal groups have produced schema.org, which has taken off widely in the web for making structured metadata embedded in web pages. At OGC, they're working with STAC, Spatio-Temporal Asset Catalog, a lightweight standard especially used for cataloging Earth observation data. And the OGC API groups are working with STAC, and also OGC API Records is working on a JSON encoding of at least a subset of 19115. So all these things are going on involving people who are part of the TC211 standardization process individually, but none of these are at present TC211 projects. So if you want to be creating metadata at the moment, there are still, unfortunately, if you like, many choices. So if you're starting from scratch, you may want to take the subset that's of interest to you from the 19115 part 1, encoded perhaps in part 3 XML. But you could use one of these things to external pieces of work to help you take that same logical set of data and encode it perhaps in JSON, or to take a subset of it that maps well to DCAT. And it's quite possible to build a system that manages the rich metadata available in 19115 with its hundreds of elements and structured packages, and then publish a subset of it out in schema.org, for example, or in DCAT, or in a JSON encoding of 19115. And as these things become mature and good practices, we'll be looking at standardizing them where that's helpful to the community. You'll still find the older 19115 2003 in use because it was in use for years. There's literally hundreds of thousands of records in that model, and using that XML encoding in national and regional profiles such as the Inspire community. So I hope that's been a useful 5 minutes or so talking through the history of how the ISO metadata got where it is, and what we're doing now, how it relates to other metadata initiatives. And that's all from me for this video.